Julia Romano's knees hit the marble floor first, the tray of wine glasses shattering beside her as two men in dark suits yanked her backward by the collar of her chef's coat. "Get up," one of them snarled, dragging her toward the kitchen doors that were still swinging from the force of her fall. Somewhere behind her, a woman screamed, not for Julia, but at her, calling her clumsy, calling her a disgrace, calling her fat in that particular tone people used when they thought size gave them permission to be cruel. Julia's palms burned against the marble. She didn't cry. She learned a long time ago that crying in front of people like this only fed them. She ruined the tasting. The woman's voice cut through the chaos. "Do you understand what's riding on tonight? Do you understand who's sitting at that table?" Julia did understand. That was the problem. She'd known the moment she walked into the private dining room 20 minutes earlier, known from the way 6 armed men stood at the perimeter like furniture arranged for war, known from the silence that pooled around the man at the head of the table, the way water pools around something too heavy to move. Dante Moretti didn't have to announce who he was. The room announced it for him. If you're new here, hit subscribe now, because what happens in the next 10 minutes changes everything for Julia, and she doesn't even know it yet. One of the suited men hauled her up by the arm hard enough to bruise, and that was when the door to the private room opened again, slower this time, and the room went from tense to silent in the particular way a room goes silent when the person everyone fears has decided to look directly at something. "Let go of her," Dante said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The man's grip loosened immediately, like Julia's arm had turned to something hot. "Sir," she dropped I said let go of her. Dante crossed the marble floor in 4 strides, tattoos climbing the exposed skin of his forearms where he'd rolled his sleeves for dinner, a black web of ink that disappeared beneath his collar and reappeared at the edge of his jaw. He crouched in front of Julia, which put a 200-pound man capable of ending a room in complete silence at eye level with a woman still on her knees, flour dust and wine soaking into the fabric of her pants. "You're bleeding," he said. Julia looked down. A shard of glass had opened a thin line across her palm. She hadn't even felt it. "It's nothing. It's not nothing." He said it flatly, like a fact he wasn't interested in arguing about, and pulled a folded handkerchief from his jacket. White linen, monogrammed, absurdly clean for a man who supposedly buried problems in concrete. He pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers around it himself. His hands were rough, calloused in a way that didn't match the suit. "Sir, please." The woman who'd screamed at her tried again. Antonella, the restaurant's front-of-house manager, her voice gone thin and careful now that Dante was standing. "She's new. She's clumsy. I'll have someone else finish this service. She can go home. We won't charge you for the—" "Who cooked the branzino?" Dante asked, not looking at Antonella at all. Nobody answered right away. "I did," Julia said. The room shifted again. She felt it, the particular attention of men who were used to reading danger in a room, suddenly redirecting all of it toward her. "You cooked it," Dante repeated, like he was testing the shape of the sentence. "The executive chef quit 2 hours before your reservation," Julia said, and she made herself stand up while she said it, made herself stop kneeling in front of him even though her legs were shaking. "Antonella asked me to finish the menu because I was the only one left who could. I didn't ruin the tasting. I dropped a tray because your man grabbed me hard enough to—" "Julia," Antonella hissed. "Hard enough to make me lose my footing." Julia finished anyway. Dante turned, finally, toward the 2 men who dragged her. Something passed over his face that made both of them take a half-step back without seeming to decide to. "Which one of you touched her?" he said. Neither answered. "I asked a question." "It was Salvo," the taller one said quickly, and the man beside him, Salvo, went the color of old paper. Dante didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You put your hands on a woman in my presence, in a room I'm sitting in, over a tray of glasses. You let that sit in the air for 3 full seconds. Wait outside. Both of you." They left. Nobody argued with Dante Moretti twice. He turned back to Julia, and for the first time since he'd crossed the room, something in his expression cracked open into an emotion that didn't belong in a room full of armed men and broken glass. Something almost like recognition, like he was looking at a memory instead of a stranger. You made the branzino with the burnt lemon butter, he said quietly. With the bread on the side, torn, not sliced. That's how my nana made it, Julius said, confused by the sudden shift in his voice. Dante didn't answer. He just stared at her hand wrapped in his handkerchief like the answer to a question he hadn't asked out loud yet. And behind him, Antonella was already whispering to someone else in the room. Too quiet for Julia to hear, but not quiet enough to hide the fear underneath it. Sir, Antonella tried again, edging closer. If she's caused a problem, I can have the sommelier finish out the... She's not causing a problem. Dante straightened up, but he didn't move away from Julia the way she expected him to. She's the only person in this building who's told me the truth in the last 20 minutes. Antonella's mouth opened and closed. Bring the rest of the courses, Dante said. She serves them. Not the sommelier. Not you. Her. Sir, she's kitchen staff. She's not trained in. I don't care what she's trained in. His eyes hadn't left Julia's face. I care what she can cook. Julia felt the eyes of every man in that room shift toward her again. And this time, it wasn't hunger for violence. It was something closer to disbelief, the kind reserved for a woman who'd survived something she shouldn't have. She wiped her palm against her apron, the small sting of the cut still fresh, and forced her voice level. I have a lamb ragu resting and a pistachio tart that needs another 8 minutes, she said. If you want it done right, I need to go finish it. Not stand here. Something flickered across Dante's mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough that one of his men actually looked startled by it. Go, he said. She went. Her hands shook the whole walk back to the kitchen, but she didn't let them see it. The kitchen, when she pushed through the double doors, was a different kind of chaos. Line cooks frozen mid-motion, the sous chef pale as a bedsheet, everyone staring at her like she'd walked out of a car, crash unscathed. What happened out there? The sous chef Marco whispered. We heard him yell at someone. He didn't yell, Julius said, pulling the ragu off the heat and tasting it with a clean spoon, adjusting the salt without thinking, her hands finding steadiness in the one place they always did. He just made someone very sorry they made a decision. Is he going to shut the restaurant down? Have someone fired? Marco's voice cracked on the last word. Everyone in the kitchen had heard the stories about Dante Moretti, the compound outside the city. The men who worked for him and disappeared quietly if they made mistakes worth disappearing over. The empire that ran quiet and clean because nobody dared test it. Nobody knew precisely what business the empire was in. Nobody asked. I don't know, Julius said honestly. But he wanted me to serve the rest of the courses myself. The kitchen went silent in a different way this time. You, Antonella said from the doorway, arms crossed, venom barely restrained under her voice now that Dante wasn't in the room to hear it. You don't get to enjoy this. He's testing you. Men like that don't rescue people. Julia, they collect them. You embarrass this restaurant one more time tonight, and I will make sure you never work in this city again. Then I guess I'd better not embarrass it, Julia said, and lifted the tray. She carried the ragu out herself, spine straight, chin level, refusing to let the tremor in her hands show in the way she set the plate down in front of Dante. He watched her do it, watched the whole motion start to finish like he was cataloging something. You're not afraid of me, he said. Not a question. I'm terrified of you, Julia said. I'm just more tired than I am terrified tonight. A low laugh went around the table from two of the men who weren't used to hearing anyone say something like that to their boss's face. Dante didn't laugh. He picked up his fork. He ate in silence for nearly a full minute, and Julia stood there because leaving without dismissal felt riskier than staying, watching the most dangerous man in the city taste something she'd made with her grandmother's hands living in her own. My mother used to make ragu like this, he said finally, quietly, like the words cost him something to hand over. Slow. No shortcuts. She'd start it in the morning and yell at anyone who touched the pot before 6. Sounds like she knew what she was doing. She did. His jaw tightened, just slightly, the ink at his throat shifting with emotion. She's been dead 11 years. Julia didn't offer condolences. Something told her he'd had enough of those, offered by people who didn't mean them to last several lifetimes. Instead, she said, then I'm glad the ragu did its job tonight. Dante looked up at her, and for a moment the entire dining room, the armed men, the frightened staff hovering at the doorway, Antonella's furious silence, seemed to fall away from him entirely, like she was the only fixed point in a room full of static. "What's your name?" he asked. "Giulia. Giulia Romano. Giulia Romano." He said it slowly, testing it, the way he'd tested the shape of "you cooked it" earlier. "Sit down." "I'm working, Mr. Moretti. I didn't ask you to serve me tonight because I wanted a waitress," he said. "Sit down. Eat something. You've been on your feet since before I arrived, and you're still bleeding through that handkerchief." Behind her, Antonella made a small, strangled sound of protest that Dante silenced with nothing more than a glance in her direction. Giulia sat. She had no idea, lowering herself into the chair across from a man capable of erasing an entire family with a phone call, that this was the exact moment 3 of the men at that table would later describe, when asked quietly years afterward, as the night everything about Dante Moretti changed. One of the guards near the door shifted his weight, uneasy, like the sight of Giulia Romano sitting at that table unsettled something in the natural order he'd spent years learning not to question. Antonella hovered by the kitchen doors, arms crossed so tightly her knuckles had gone white, watching the scene like she was watching her own authority dissolve in real time. "Eat," Dante said again, nodding toward the untouched plate a nervous waiter had set in front of Giulia. "You made enough for the table. You can have some of it." "I don't usually eat my own cooking sitting across from clients," Giulia said. "I'm not a client." He said it the way other men might say, "I'm not a stranger," flat, absolute, an unspoken invitation to stop treating him like a category. "I own the building this restaurant sits in. I own the lease Antonella is currently terrified of losing. Tonight isn't a tasting menu, Giulia. It's a decision about whether this place stays open past the month." Giulia's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Nobody told the kitchen that. Nobody was supposed to. His eyes moved briefly toward Antonella, and something colder passed behind them. "She's been skimming from supplier invoices for the better part of the year. I only found out 3 days ago." The color drained from Antonella's face so fast Giulia almost felt sorry for her. Almost, until she remembered the woman's fingers digging in her collar 20 minutes earlier, remembered disgrace, said like it was Giulia's body that had ruined the night and not someone else's greed. "That's not," Antonella started. "Don't," Dante said, and the single word landed like a door closing. He didn't even raise his voice. He didn't need to. The 2 guards near the entrance straightened without being told to. Giulia looked between them, understanding arriving in pieces the way understanding does when you're standing in a room built on secrets you weren't invited to know. So the tasting tonight was never about the food. It was entirely about the food, Dante said, turning back to her, and something in his voice softened by a fraction most people in that room would never have caught. "I needed to see if this kitchen was worth saving. Now I know it is." He paused. "Because of you. If you were Giulia right now, sitting across from a man who could burn your whole world down or become the reason it stays standing, would you trust him? Tell me in the comments before you keep reading, because what he says next is going to test that answer." Giulia set her fork down carefully, like the motion itself needed permission. "And what happens to everyone else? Marco, the line cooks, the waitstaff who've done nothing wrong. They keep their jobs." Dante's gaze didn't waver. "Antonella doesn't." Antonella made a sound like she'd been struck, and one of the guards moved toward her without being asked, a silent, practiced motion that told Giulia this had happened before, that men like Dante Moretti had systems for exactly this kind of ending. "You can't just, this is my restaurant. I built the reputation of this." "You built a reputation on stolen invoices and a staff too afraid to report you," Dante said. "I've known for 3 days. I let tonight happen because I wanted to see how you'd behave under pressure, and you spent the entire evening screaming at the one person who saved your service." He gestured, almost lazily, toward the door. "Take her file to my office in the morning. I'll decide what happens next." 2 of the men flanked Antonella and walked her out without another word, her protests trailing behind her, swallowed by the heavy doors before they'd even finished. The dining room exhaled. Even the air seemed to loosen. Julia sat very still, the handkerchief still wrapped around her palm, blood dried now into the white linen in a small dark bloom. She was aware, suddenly, of every eye still in the room, of the strange gravity that had pulled her chair 6 feet closer to the center of something enormous without her ever agreeing to step into it. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "You could have had anyone finish tonight's service. A trained server. Someone who knew how to navigate a room like this." "Because you didn't flinch," Dante said. "Everyone in this restaurant has spent the last hour flinching. Salvo grabbed you hard enough to draw blood, and you still stood up and told me the truth instead of apologizing for something that wasn't your fault." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table, the tattoos there catching the low light, a rosary twisted with thorns, a woman's name inked over his knuckles that Julia didn't ask about yet. "I don't trust people who apologize for things that aren't their fault. It usually means they've learned to make themselves smaller so men like me don't notice them. And you noticed me. I noticed you the second you stood up off that floor," he said, "before I even knew you could cook." Julia felt heat climb her throat that had nothing to do with the kitchen she'd spent the last 6 hours sweating in. She reached for something steadier to say and came up empty, which almost never happened to her. "I should get back to the kitchen," she said instead. "The tart needs to come out." "Julia." She stopped, halfway out of the chair. "Come back out when it's plated," Dante said. "I want you to serve dessert yourself. And then I want to talk to you about something that has nothing to do with tonight's menu." Behind her, Marco was already at the kitchen door, having clearly heard enough of the conversation through the swinging gap to go pale for an entirely different reason than before, mouthing something that looked very much like what had you just agreed to. Julia didn't know yet, but for the first time all night, walking back toward the heat of the kitchen with Dante Moretti's eyes on her back, she wasn't afraid to find out. The tart came out golden and cracked exactly the way it should, pistachio and burnt honey filling the kitchen with a smell that made even Marco's shoulders drop half an inch for the first time all night. Julia plated it herself, hands steadier now than they'd been an hour ago, and carried it back into the dining room where the guards had repositioned themselves like nothing had happened, like a woman hadn't just been marched out in disgrace 20 minutes earlier. Dante watched her set the plate down. "You didn't rush it. Rushing a tart is how you ruin a tart," Julia said. "Some things can't be hurried just because the room is tense. I'm learning that about you." He gestured to the chair across from him again. "Seat." She hesitated only a second before she did. "I meant what I said," Dante told her once she'd settled. "About talking to you. I'm renovating 3 restaurants across the city this year. All of them need someone who understands food the way you understand food. Not someone who read about it in culinary school. Someone who cooks the way their grandmother taught them, with instinct. Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you Antonella's job. Head of kitchen operations for this location, with authority over hiring, menu, everything. Tonight would have closed this place by the end of the month if you hadn't stepped in." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, like the words had already been decided long before they reached his mouth. "I don't make offers I take back." Julia opened her mouth to answer, and that was the exact moment the dining room doors opened again, not with the careful deference the staff used, but hard, fast, heels striking marble like punctuation. "Dante," a woman's voice, sharp and cold, cut across the room before Julia had even turned to look. "You said this dinner would be finished an hour ago. I've been waiting in the car like an idiot." Julia turned. The woman crossing the floor toward them was striking in the particular engineered way that took money and discipline to maintain. Dark hair pinned severely, a dress that had clearly never seen a wrinkle, diamonds at her throat that caught the light like a warning. Her eyes swept over Julia in less than a second and dismissed her in less than that. "Beatrice," Dante said, and something in his voice went flat, careful, the warmth from a moment ago folding itself away like it had never existed. "I told you I'd call when I was done. You've been in here for 2 hours. Beatrice's gaze landed on Julia's still-bandaged hand, then on the empty chair pulled close to Dante's, and something calculating moved behind her expression. "And who is this? Kitchen staff eating at your table now." "Julia runs the kitchen," Dante said. "As of tonight." "Does she?" Beatrice's mouth, curve into something that wasn't a smile. How efficient of you, promoting the help mid-service. Julia felt the old, familiar heat crawl up her neck. Not embarrassment this time, but something closer to anger, sharpened by 6 years of restaurant kitchens where women like Beatrice walked through back of house like it was a museum exhibit built for their entertainment. She didn't say anything. She'd learned that silence, held the right way, could do more damage than a retort. Beatrice is joining our family's businesses, Dante said, and the word businesses carried a weight Julia was only beginning to understand. Our fathers arranged the match 2 years ago. It's practical. It keeps peace between two organizations that have spent 30 years trying to kill each other instead of working together. How romantic, Julia said before she could stop herself. Beatrice's eyes cut to her, sharp as the diamonds at her throat. I'm sorry, are the staff permitted to speak now? Or was that a special exception? Beatrice. Dante's voice carried a warning this time, low and precise. No, it's fine, Julia said, standing, smoothing her apron down with hands that had gone steady again despite everything. I should get back to the kitchen. Congratulations on the engagement. The word came out cleaner than she expected, considering the way her chest had tightened around it without permission. She turned to go, and Dante's hand closed, briefly, lightly, around her wrist. Julia. She looked back. The offer stands, he said, quiet enough that Beatrice had to lean in to hear it, which seemed, somehow, exactly the point. Come to my office tomorrow at 10. We'll discuss terms. Terms for what? Beatrice said. A kitchen position, or something else. Careful, Dante said, and this time the word wasn't gentle at all. Julia didn't wait to hear the rest. She walked back through the kitchen doors with her spine straight and her pulse loud in her ears, and it wasn't until she was alone in the walk-in, catching her breath against the cold shelving, that she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. An engagement she hadn't known about, a woman who'd looked at her like she was something to be scraped off a shoe, and a man whose hand around her wrist had felt like something she had no business wanting to feel again. Marco found her there 2 minutes later. You okay? He's engaged, Julia said, more to herself than to him. To Beatrice Falcone. Marco's eyebrows went up. You didn't know? It's not exactly a secret. Their fathers have been planning that merger since before I started working here. It's not really a marriage from what I hear. It's a business contract with a dress. That's not my business either way, Julia said, though the sentence came out less convincing than she wanted it to. Sure, Marco said, in the tone of a man who clearly didn't believe her, and went back to the line before she could argue. Out in the dining room, though neither of them could hear it, Beatrice had lowered her voice to something closer to venom. You didn't tell me you were hiring kitchen staff to warm your table, Dante. She's not staff to me, Dante said, watching the kitchen doors where Julia had disappeared, something unreadable settling into his jaw. Not anymore. Beatrice's eyes narrowed, and behind that narrow, calculating look, something had already begun to shift. Quiet, deliberate, the first cold turn of a plan Julia wouldn't see coming until it was much too late to stop it. The next morning, Julia stood outside a glass office tower she had no business standing outside of, smoothing down a blazer she'd borrowed from her cousin because none of her own clothes felt right for a meeting with a man who owned half the block she was standing on. The receptionist barely glanced up before waving her through, like Julia's arrival had already been expected, already been cleared by someone higher up than protocol. Dante's office took up the entire top floor, glass on 3 sides, the city spread out beneath it like something he'd already decided belonged to him. He stood when she walked in, which surprised her more than it should have. You came, he said. You said terms. I like knowing what I'm agreeing to before I agree to it. A faint curve touched his mouth. Seat. She sat, and he slid a folder across the desk toward her. Salary figures that made her breath catch, full creative control over the menu, a signing bonus that could clear the debt she'd been carrying since her mother's hospital bills 3 years ago. She stared at the numbers for a long moment before she trusted herself to speak. This is a lot more than a kitchen position. You're worth a lot more than a kitchen position. He said it simply, without performance, the way he said most things. I've had people running my restaurants for years who've never once made a room go quiet the way you did last night. Not with fear, with respect. Careful, Julius said, echoing the word he'd used on Beatrice the night before. That started to sound like something other than a business offer. Dante didn't deny it. He also didn't confirm it, which somehow said more than either would have. Sign it, he said instead. Or don't. But don't pretend you didn't feel something happen in that dining room last night, because I did, and I don't imagine things. Before Julia could answer, the office door opened without a knock, and Beatrice walked in like she owned the floor beneath her heels, which, Julia realized with a sinking feeling, she likely would, eventually. I need to speak with you, Beatrice said to Dante, then let her gaze drift, deliberately slow, over Julia and the folder open on the desk between them. Alone. I'm in the middle of something, Dante said. So am I. Beatrice's smile was thin, surgical. It concerns her. Something in Julia's stomach went cold. My father did some research last night, Beatrice continued, not waiting for permission, after I mentioned your new little discovery. Turns out Julia Romano isn't quite the humble line cook she's playing. Her father ran supply routes for the Bianchi family for 15 years, before they collapsed, before half of them ended up dead or in prison. She let that settle, watching Julia's face for the flinch she clearly expected. You didn't know that, did you, Dante? You brought a Bianchi's daughter into your kitchen, into your office, and you didn't even run a background check. The silence that followed had weight to it, physical, pressing. Is that true? Dante asked, and his voice had gone somewhere Julia hadn't heard it go before. Not cruel, but careful, guarded, a door closing partway. My father worked for them, yes, Julia said, forcing her voice level even as her pulse roared in her ears. 20 years ago. I was 11 when he stopped. He got out because he didn't want that life touching me or my mother, and it still found us anyway. We spent 3 years moving between relatives' houses because men he used to work with thought he owed them something on his way out. Her hands were steady on the folder, even though nothing else in her felt steady at all. I didn't hide it because it's some secret weapon, Beatrice. I didn't bring it up because it has nothing to do with how I cook a piece of fish. It has everything to do with whether you can be trusted in a building full of men who could be killed by information like that. Beatrice snapped. Comment below. Do you think Dante should trust Julia after this? Or is Beatrice right to be suspicious? I want to know where you land before we get to what happens next. She's not the one who's been lying, Dante said quietly, and the temperature in the room shifted again, this time away from Julia. Sit down, Beatrice. Excuse me? Sit down, he said again, because we're going to talk about the actual reason you came up here uninvited, and it isn't concern for my security. He rounded the desk slowly, and Julia watched something settle into his shoulders that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the version of him from the dining room the night before, the one capable of silencing a man with a single word. I had a man look into the merger paperwork last week. The dowry your father's putting up isn't coming from Falcone accounts. It's coming from a shell company registered 3 months ago, funneled through 2 banks that don't officially exist. He let that land. You've been skimming from your own father's arrangement, Beatrice, setting up an exit before the wedding even happens. Which makes me wonder what exactly you're planning to exit into. Beatrice's face went the color of old paper, the same shade salvos had gone the night before, and for the first time since she'd walked into the room, she had nothing sharp to say. You don't know what you're talking about, she managed finally. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Dante said. I just wanted to see if you'd deny it to my face before I decided what to do about it. He glanced at Julia, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. An apology, maybe, or the beginning of one. Julia, give us the room. Julia stood, folder in hand, legs unsteady beneath her despite every effort to keep them still, and walked out past Beatrice without meeting her eyes. But she heard it anyway, just before the door closed behind her. Beatrice's voice, low and venomous, no longer performing for an audience. You'll regret choosing a Bianchi's daughter over me, Dante. I promise you that. And Dante's answer, quieter, colder than anything Julia had heard from him yet. I already regret choosing you. That's the mistake I'm about to fix. Julia didn't go back to the kitchen that day. She went home instead, sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the apartment she'd shared with her mother's memory ever since the hospital bills stopped matching, and let herself shake for the first time since the tray of glasses had shattered on that marble floor. Her father's name, spoken out loud in a glass office by a woman wielding it like a blade. It had been years since anyone had used it against her, and she'd forgotten how fast the old fear could resurface, how easily 11-year-old Julia could climb back in her chest and take over. Her phone buzzed at 9 that night. Dante's name on the screen, no message, just a request. "Can I come by?" She almost said no. She typed it twice and deleted it twice. And then, against every instinct that had kept her safe for the last 15 years, she sent back an address instead. He arrived alone. No guards, no suit, just a black jacket over a plain shirt, looking younger somehow, without the armor of his office around him. He stood in her doorway like a man and used to standing anywhere he hadn't already claimed. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "Beatrice is no longer part of the arrangement," he said finally. "Her father confirmed the shell company tonight. The engagement's over. My father's furious. Hers is worse. And half the families in this city are going to spend the next month pretending they didn't see it coming." "That's not why you're here," Julia said. "You could have told me that over the phone." "No," he admitted. "I'm here because I spent all day thinking about what you said, that your father tried to give you a life without this world touching it, and it found you anyway." He stepped inside when she moved back to let him. "I don't want to be the thing that finds you again, Julia. I want to be honest about that before anything else happens between us." "Then be honest," she said. "Why does it matter so much to you? One dinner, one kitchen. You could have hired anyone." "Because you didn't perform for me," Dante said, and his voice had none of the careful control from the office, none of the eyes from the dining room. Just something raw underneath it, something he looked almost surprised to hear coming out of his own mouth. "Every person in my life has spent years telling me what they think I want to hear. Beatrice included. You told me the truth on your knees in a room full of my own men, bleeding, with nothing to gain from it. I haven't stopped thinking about that since." Julia's throat tightened. "I have a Bianchi's blood in me. You said it yourself. Information like that gets people killed." "I said it to Beatrice to watch her flinch," Dante said. "I don't care whose daughter you are. I care what you did with the life you built after your father tried to give you a different one. You didn't become bitter. You didn't become someone who used what you knew as leverage. You became a woman who feeds people like it's the only apology the world owes anybody." He reached for her hand, the same one he'd wrapped in his handkerchief 2 nights before, the small cut nearly healed now. "I've spent 11 years running an empire I never wanted, surrounded by people who fear me or want something from me. You're the first person who's done neither. This is the moment. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe now, because what he says next is the reason 4 million people couldn't stop talking about this story." Julia looked down at their joined hands, at the ink crawling over his knuckles, at the small tremor she hadn't expected to find in someone people described as untouchable. "What are you asking me, Dante?" "I'm not asking you to run a kitchen," he said quietly. "Already gave you that. I'm asking you to marry me. Not because our fathers arranged it. Not because it keeps peace between 2 families who've spent 30 years hating each other. Because I watched you stand up off a floor you had every reason to stay down on, and I knew, before I even knew your name, that I wasn't going to let another woman like Beatrice sit across from me and pretend at a life I actually wanted with you instead." For a long moment, Julia said nothing at all. She thought of Antonella's voice calling her a disgrace. She thought of Beatrice's diamonds catching the light like a warning. She thought of every kitchen she'd ever worked in where men looked past her, around her, through her, like her body was an inconvenience to be tolerated rather than a woman standing inside it, cooking food that made grown men remember their mothers. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "it's not because you're powerful. It's not because of the money in that folder. It's because you're the first person in this entire city who looked at me on my knees and saw someone worth kneeling beside, not someone to step over." "Then say yes," Dante said, "for that reason and no other." "Yes," Julia said. He kissed her like a man who'd spent his whole life being careful and had finally found the one thing he didn't want to be careful with anymore. 6 months later, The wedding took place in a courtyard strung with lights, and Dante made sure, quietly, deliberately, that every member of the original restaurant staff who'd once looked past Julia was seated at the reception, serving alongside a new head chef who plated each course with the same instinct Julia had taught her. Antonella wasn't there. Beatrice wasn't either. But Marco stood near the kitchen doors, grinning through the whole ceremony, and when Julia walked past him in white, he leaned over and whispered, Nana would be proud. She could feel it in every dish she'd cooked to get here. If this story moved you, don't just scroll past it. Like it, share it with someone who needs to believe the world still rewards people who refuse to shrink themselves, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Because sometimes the people who laugh loudest at you are the ones standing closest when your whole life changes.